In 1798 and 1799, you found Madison and Jefferson with the opportunity to settle a debate that had been ongoing since 1787 when the Constitution was written. The Jeffersonians believed that it was the states who had the power to interpret the Constitution based on the fact that they, the states, had created the Constitution. So they actually predated the Constitution. Therefore, under this compact theory, they should be the ones who could declare laws unconstitutional. The Federalists believed that it should actually be the power of the central government, and that will later be resolved by John Marshall in Marbury versus Madison in 1803. But prior to that being resolved, you have Virginia Resolution, written by Thomas Jefferson, Virginia Resolution, written by James Madison, and Kentucky Resolution, written by Thomas Jefferson, which claimed that the Alien and Sedition Acts passed by a Federalist Congress are in fact unconstitutional. And what they said was the Alien Act, which would allow Congress to move the citizenship requirement from 5 to 14 years, thereby punishing French and Irish immigrants who would come to the United States and most likely would support Jefferson, as well as the Sedition Act, which aimed to punish anybody that spoke negatively or wrote negatively about the Federalist Party, and also gave the president the power to send away sort of dangerous people in times of war, was specifically designed to hurt Jefferson. In fact, the Federalists were smart enough to make sure that this particular law would basically extinguish itself at the beginning of the next term so it couldn't be used against him. Now, the protest of the Alien and Sedition Acts in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions never really went anywhere. It proposed this compact theory, but no other states picked up on the idea, and as a result, it died in terms of having any effect at the moment. However, it's of course going to live on, and it's going to be the basis of the South Carolina claims in the nullification crisis, and then will persist all the way to the eve of the Civil War. It's important to realize that the Articles of Confederation were actually the government that helped the newly independent colonies through the American Revolution and are going to serve as the first government of the United States of America. Now, the important idea of a confederation, which is an association of independent sovereign states, is that these states still didn't really see themselves as unified in any real way, just as they had been during the colonial era from 1607 all the way through 1776. They were different economically, they were different religiously, they were different geographically, and they wanted a weak national government as they had just fought off an oppressive brute in Britain, and they really wanted the power to lie with the states, not with a strong central government. So in doing so, they made it so that each state only had one vote, regardless of population. They only had one house, which is unicameral. They had no separate executive and no separate judiciary. So we see that it's built in weaknesses already, weaknesses that they don't anticipate are going to require any sort of major revision, but soon we will see that they will. Now, their goal in having this weak government was having it so that the central government would perform sort of certain main functions. In doing so, they would conduct foreign relations, they could coin money, set up post offices, they could establish an army, they could declare war, but there were some real limitations. So any major law that had to be passed by 9 of the 13. If they were going to amend the articles, it required unanimity, all 13. But the government had some major problems, or I should say the country had major problems that this new weak government couldn't deal with. There were some really significant war debts, and frankly, the Articles of Confederation couldn't collect taxes, and they couldn't afford an army or a navy. So when any problems are going to rise up, the inability to borrow money or raise an army is going to create some major issues. In addition, you have states essentially waging economic warfare with each other, and there's no real power to regulate interstate commerce in any way from this weak government. In addition, it's got problems with foreign governments. The British never left their forts, as they promised to do in the Treaty of Paris. In addition, the British seem to keep arming the Native Americans out west, hoping perhaps that if they keep in good contact and on good relationship with the Native Americans, perhaps the Native Americans can be their conduit to help them get back in to North America. There are a group of farmers, particularly backcountry farmers in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, who sought debt relief. Namely, they got paper currency, continentals from the war, and that money wasn't worth anything anymore, and their farms were being foreclosed upon, so they tried to prevent the courts from seizing property. And in doing so, they were going to take up arms against this oppressive government, much as we had seen the colonists take up arms against the oppressive British government, and they thought they were acting really in the spirit of the revolution. Unfortunately, this national government, this weak Articles of Confederation, couldn't respond appropriately, and so they had to think about how are we going to do this. In fact, the state of Massachusetts had to basically use its own money to pay soldiers to come out and put down this rebellion. While the Articles of Confederation is generally seen as a weak government, the one success that you can attribute to that time would be what they did in the Northwest Territory. And of course, that's going to be sort of land that was originally part of the new states, and states with a lot of land gave it up to the federal government, actually just the national government at the time, sort of as a show of good faith that we're going to all be together. So that land is basically where we live today: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Michigan. And what you're going to see in the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which frankly we just refer to as the Northwest Ordinance, is how you're going to divide up land. And so they're going to divide it up into 36 sections that are each 1 mile. And the important part is that one of those sections would be sold to support public education. In addition, we're going to see surprising religious freedom. We're not going to see slavery allowed in the Northwest Territory. And we're also going to see this idea of how a district can become a territory, which can become a state. So a district could become a territory once you got to 5,000 people, and a territory could write a constitution and apply to statehood when you got a population of 60,000. So this is going to be setting a precedent for how you're going to organize new land. But even with the success of the Northwest Ordinance, it was clear to many people, particularly the conservative elements of the country, some of whom had been radicals just 10 years earlier, they're concerned that what we're seeing is a mobocracy, the specter of Shays and the Shayites sort of coming back over and over and over again. So what they're going to do is they're going to come together to try to revise this Articles of Confederation. It's not to get rid of it at first. It is simply a revision. Now, 12 of the 13 states attend. Rhode Island, of course, independent to the end, refuses. They don't want a stronger central government. So there are two plans that are proposed when they get together in Philadelphia for the Constitutional Convention. One is the Virginia plan, which would give more power to the states, and frankly would give more power to the larger states, as the representatives would be based on population. The New Jersey plan was proposed, which would give more power to the small states. That means that every state would have an equal number of representatives. Now, this is going to be resolved in what's known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise, where they're going to agree to have a bicameral legislature, a two-house legislature. The lower house, which we know as the House of Representatives, would have representation based on population. They would also have the power where all revenue-generating bills, all tax bills, would start in the House. Now, the upper house, the Senate, would have an equal number of representatives, and they'd have the important role of approving treaties and appointments. As we will see later in history, their really big deal is ratifying presidential appointments for the cabinet as well as Supreme Court justices. Now, they had to deal with slavery, as obviously the North and the South differ on this. And what they decided was that it would be a 3/5 compromise, that all slaves in the South would count as 3/5, not only in terms of representation, which would certainly help the South, but in terms of taxation, which would mean the South would be actually ponying up money for all the slaves that they have there. In addition, they're going to agree to not do anything about the slave trade for 20 years. So you can have the slave trade until the last day of 1807. In addition, they're going to agree to a fugitive slave law, which is going to say that the North has to help return any slaves that go from the South to the North. Now, obviously, this is going to be a real problem. The South doesn't think that the North is following this. And then, obviously, in 1850, we're going to see a stronger fugitive slave law. In order to get this Constitution ratified, it's going to need to go out to special state conventions. And it's not going to be a slam dunk by any means, because you have the Federalists who are supporters of the Constitution, and you have the Anti-Federalists who are opponents of the Constitution. And before they leave Philadelphia, you sort of have this question of, should we have a Bill of Rights? And they actually never resolve it. They sort of say, well, I guess we should have a Bill of Rights, but we've been here too long, it's too hot, we'll deal with that later. So the Federalists are the people that really support this Constitution. They support a stronger central government. They believe it's going to maintain order, preserve the Union. They look at the Articles of Confederation and they say, you know what? That did not work. We need something that is going to be more substantial with more centralized power. It was generally something that was supported in cities, tended to be supported more by merchants and businessmen, and frankly was the more organized of the two factions. I wouldn't even call them parties yet. The Anti-Federalists said, no, no, no. We just came from tyrannical central government. We don't want to go back to that. And they say, you know what? States' rights are going to be gone, and individual liberties are going to be gone if we allow this much power in the central government. And frankly speaking, you know what? We think this is a rich and educated party. How about the common man? How about the farmer? But unfortunately, they were not as well organized, as farmers and planters never seemed to be as well organized. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists particularly differed on this Bill of Rights. The Anti-Federalists are the ones who said, we need a Bill of Rights. We need it specifically spelled out in the Constitution what rights will be protected because we fear a strong central government. The Federalists said, wait a second, you don't want a Bill of Rights because if you actually spell out exactly what you're protected from, it leaves everything else that is not spelled out where you can actually be abused. The ratification fight is going to play out across the many states. Of course, Delaware is going to be the first to ratify, being known as a Constitution state, but perhaps the most interesting played out in New York, where the Federalist Papers are specifically written by James Madison and Hamilton, who at this point are together but are soon going to diverge. And in writing this Federalist, they hoped that it would explain to the New Yorkers the advantages that a stronger central government would bring. Now, the biggest idea here comes across in something that Madison wrote called Federalist Number 10. And what he was actually saying was, a central government will help control factions. That means small groups that sort of rise up and battle each other. He says, you know what, these groups, these factions are a natural part of American society, but this new system would actually help sort of neutralize the factions. They wouldn't war against each other because they'd actually have to work together to get things done. As a result of the pro-Constitution propaganda in New York will ratify. Massachusetts, perhaps one of the most influential, will only ratify based on the promise that there is going to be a Bill of Rights. And so James Madison, who actually helped write the Constitution, will write the Bill of Rights. And if you think about it, the Constitution is more of a conservative document, and the Bill of Rights is considered sort of more of, quote-unquote, a liberal document or not as conservative of a document. Now, the first 8 amendments deal with individual civil liberties, namely what people are protected from. So they don't have to quarter soldiers, that's the third. They have the right to bear arms, that's the second. They have the right to freedom of speech and religion and petition and press and assembly, that's of course the first. They are protected against cruel and unusual punishment. The 8th, all of these are things that they're protected from the government. However, the 9th Amendment says, listen, just because these rights are listed doesn't mean that there are not other rights as well. And number 10 is perhaps most important for people like Jefferson, who say, listen, we need a states' rights amendment that specifically says that if a power is not granted in the Constitution, specifically and explicitly written there, it belongs to the states. Technically, the Bill of Rights is actually passed during Washington's first term. So Washington was unanimously elected president. John Adams became his vice president, and he's going to basically put together the first cabinet. Now, there was no need for a cabinet. It didn't say there needed to be in the Constitution, but you're going to have important people, influential people like Secretary of State. It's going to be Thomas Jefferson, and of course, his adversary is going to be the Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton is going to be sort of the unofficial leader of the Federalists who want a strong central government. Now we're going to move from sort of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists to the Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans. Jefferson is the leader, obviously, of the Jeffersonian Republicans, but now he's got Madison on his side. Madison, who's somebody who had written the Federalist Papers, so he's now sort of jumped ship. And of course, these Jeffersonian Republicans, carrying on the ideas of the Anti-Federalists, want a smaller central government. They tend to be more rural than urban. And it's important to know that Hamilton really seemed to have Washington's ear, although Washington wouldn't say he was a Federalist at all. But Hamilton's plan really comes down to 4 parts. And the first part deals with debt. And so Hamilton's going to suggest that they fund all debts at par, and that is all of the debts that people have that are outstanding from the revolution, they should pay them back at face value. Now, this was good for speculators who were friends with Hamilton because many of these bonds had been selling for 10 cents on the dollar. So in paying them back in full, they actually benefited the people that went out and bought the bonds, the IOUs, from the poor folks. And in addition, there's also assumption, which is going to mean that you're going to take the debt from the states. So no longer will the states owe rich people money, but the federal government will owe that money. And now, the important part about that is that the idea is that if the federal government now owes rich people money, those rich people will have a vested interest in the success of the new country. Now, getting this assumption passed was actually pretty tricky. Hamilton basically had to compromise with Thomas Jefferson, saying, if you support this assumption plan, you can get a federal capital near you, and that's where we get Washington, D.C. An additional part of Hamilton's plan, which will continue to be part of not only the Federalists, but the Whigs and later the Republicans, is going to be this idea of a tariff. And of course, Hamilton had this vision that the United States would someday emulate Britain and would be an industrial economy, and you need a tariff to be able to protect your economy so that other countries, like Britain, which they will do, can't flood your market with cheap goods. Now, he did get a tariff in 1789, which was not as high as he wanted, so he wasn't getting federal revenue, so he's actually going to pass an excise tax, which is going to be a tax basically on liquor, and it's going to target backwoods whiskey makers, which we're going to see the result is the Whiskey Rebellion, but he's going to find a way to get revenue coming in. But the most controversial part of his plan was this idea for a national bank, modeled after the kind of bank that Britain had. And there were two real views on the Constitution. There was this strict construction, the idea that the federal government can only do what the Constitution specifically says it can do. And that's going to be a sort of a Jeffersonian idea. The Hamiltonian loose construction says, well, you know what, the government can do what it needs to as long as it's not specifically prohibited. And he used the necessary and proper clause, which is Article 1, Section 8. It's the 18th point, which says basically that Congress can do what is necessary and proper to carry out the first 17 functions. And so it said because Congress has the power to borrow money and collect taxes, it would thereby make sense, necessary and proper, to have a bank. Jefferson, of course, opposes this bank, much as Jackson will later on, but since Hamilton seems to have Washington's ear, the bank ultimately gets passed with a 20-year charter. So Hamilton's plan really comes down to dealing with debt, which is going to be funding at par and assumption. You're going to see the tariff. Tariff's not big enough, so you see the excise tax, and then you're going to have BOTUS. Well, there was some real objection, of course, to this excise tax, particularly people, the backwoods frontier guys who actually made their livelihood distilling their grain into rye whiskey. And so because they felt that this tax was particularly injurious to them and really focused on them, the farmers are going to attack tax collectors, sort of almost like we saw with Shays' Rebellion, going back all the way to sort of the Stamp Act that we saw. But Washington is not going to allow this to be his Shays' Rebellion. He's not going to allow it to cause the country problems. So he's actually going to send out 15,000 state militiamen under his command and with Alexander Hamilton to put down this uprising. And now, there was no need to have 15,000 men. By the time they actually got out there, it seems that the crowds had totally dispersed. But it was a show of force to say, this national government, can't be scared. Okay, it's something to be reckoned with, and this obviously the Westerners felt that it was an unwarranted use of force against the common people. But Washington got his message across. Now, during this Federalist era, we are really going to see these two parties crystallize. Whereas we hadn't had real parties before, we'd only had factions. We are now going to officially have the Federalists as well as the Democratic Republicans, which are the name that Jefferson's followers took. Now, a main difference between these two were their feelings on England and France, who had constantly been going back and forth, and now they are back at war. Now, the Jeffersonians tend to be Francophiles, far more sympathetic to the French, and also quite thankful that the French had helped us out during the Revolution with the Franco-American alliance. But Washington is not going to be drawn into this particular struggle between France and Britain, despite the fact that Hamilton's on the side of the British and Jefferson's on the side of the French. So he's going to make his neutrality proclamation in 1793, which is really going to be a cornerstone of American foreign policy from there out. Of course, we will see Edmond Genet, a French ambassador, coming to the United States, trying to get Americans to support the French cause, and it's not going to turn out well for him as Washington demands that Genet be sent home. But at the end of the day, we still continue to have the British seizing American ships. We still got forts on American soil, and so we're going to try to figure out how can we finally resolve this. I thought we'd resolve this back in the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris of 1783. But what we're going to have is we're going to have another attempt to try to solve this. So we're going to send John Jay, who happened to be the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, to negotiate with the British. He's going to try to get the British to pay for these American ships that have been lost and get the Indians, get the forts out of the Northwest Territory. And Hamilton basically sells out Jay because he doesn't want in any way to hurt this profitable relationship between Britain and the United States. And at the end of the day, it looks as if Jay has capitulated to the crown because really this treaty is not very good for the Americans. The one, benefit that does come out of it is that the Spanish look at us seemingly getting back together with the British, and they want in. They want to be with all of us. So they actually signed Pinckney's Treaty, which is going to settle a number of disputes between the United States and Spain and actually set up what will be known as the Louisiana Purchase. Well, Jay's treaty was probably the low point of Washington's presidency, as it appeared that we were getting back together with Britain in a way that made people question why we fought the revolution in the first place. When he does step down after 2 terms, he sets a precedent that's not going to be broken until obviously FDR runs for a 3rd term in 1940. But his farewell address sort of had 2 main points. America should avoid political parties because they are divisive. By this point, however, it seems that the horse is out of the barn as people have really gone either one way towards Adams and Hamilton and the Federalist Party or towards Jefferson and Madison, the Democratic Republicans. But just as importantly, he says we should avoid permanent alliances, entangling alliances. Doesn't mean that we can't be in temporary alliances, but we should do our best to remain as independent as possible, which we really will do all the way until we join NATO in 1949.